what I'm presenting is based on a paper that I've published, and I presented it to Father Giordano. I said, could this topic be useful for the event? He said yes. So let me present to you the main ideas of this paper on chastity and respect for human life. In his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II makes a somewhat controversial claim. He says that contraception and abortion are fruits of the same tree. And of course, people object, and even he is smart enough, he knew that people would object and have objected, and he even anticipates the objection, and he says, well, isn't it common wisdom that if you want to avoid abortions, you need to promote contraception? Because abortions result from unwanted pregnancies, and unwanted pregnancies are prevented by means of contraception. More contraception, fewer abortions. That, he says, is a logic that we hear about, and he says, I don't buy it. I think he says, no, abortion and contraception are the fruits of the same tree. And he gives an argument in Evangelium Vitae, and it's that argument that I would like to expand on. So what does he say? How does he defend himself against the objection that the church may even be a promoter of abortion? That people told him, you are promoting abortion because you're fighting contraception. He says, no, I'm not. So what does he say? He says that the practice of contraception encourages a hedonistic mentality. I cited a citation, a hedonistic mentality that is unwilling to accept responsibility in matters of sexuality. Therefore, abortion then becomes the only possible decisive response to failed contraception. End of citation. For John Paul II, contraception and abortion are specifically different in moral species. He actually has a paragraph on that. There are a couple of moral theologians before the time of Humane Vitae. They said, well, actually, what is wrong with contraception is that it is an anti-life will, and whoever who practices contraception is as if he committed murder. And that argument had sparked controversy. It was based also on an outdated biology. Theologians in the Middle Ages thought there was a little homunculus in the sperm, and you waste the sperm, and then contraception is like homicide. And John Paul II says, no, it's not. Contraception is a sin against chastity. Abortion is a sin against life. The two sins are specifically different, and also the gravity is very, very much different, evidently. But, however, they are nonetheless connected in their genesis. So, contraception is an offense against chastity, abortion against human life. But there is this relationship between unchastity and disrespect for human life, or chastity and respect for human life. He says in Evangelium Vitae, that's one of the fundamental theses that I want to explore. He says, the trivialization of sexuality is among the principal factors which have led to contempt for new life. Yeah, end of quote. So, trivialization of sexuality, evidently, how do we trivialize sexuality? By separating sex and procreation through contraception. Contraception is trivializing sexuality. And that, he says, is a principal factor to have led to the contempt of human life, and the response, or the challenge, the main thing that one can do, what one needs to do, what is absolutely necessary to do, is to offer young people, I cite, an authentic education in sexuality and in love, an education which involves training in chastity as a virtue, so they will rediscover the spousal meaning of their bodies. So training in chastity, virtue education, promoting chastity, that, he says, is a necessary step to counteract the trivialization of sexuality, and with that also the contempt against human life. If I may cite also a very interesting passage from Paul VI, when he was just very briefly, shortly before his death, he was celebrating 15 years since his coronation, and it was almost 10 years after Humane Vitae. He, in this discourse, he speaks about the council, about Gaudium et Spes, how the council in Gaudium et Spes advocates and emphasizes the need to protect human life from contraception, from conception to natural death. And then he comments on that passage in Gaudium et Spes, and he says, aside Paul VI, commenting on his encyclical Humane Vitae, he says, we did no more in our encyclical than to gather this teaching of Gaudium et Spes on the protection of human life. We did no more than that when we proclaimed the encyclical Humane Vitae. That is, we invited for the defense of human life. And he brings out the rationale of this claim in this brief sentence. Paul VI says, the defense of life must start from the very sources of human existence. The defense of life must start from the sources of human existence. The sources of human existence are evidently, it's our sexuality, and which in turn is guarded by the virtue of chastity. But how exactly does the virtue of chastity help us to promote a sense of the preciousness of human life? What is the philosophical and experiential basis of this intuition that John Paul II proposed? And here I want to proceed in 3 steps. First of all, I would like to present some statistical data on the connection of contraception and abortion, and we will see that this correlation is not as clear-cut as some people would think. I would then like to talk about what is called by St. Thomas, then by the English philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, who brought this back into currency, what is called connatural knowledge, and then finally to see the results of the separation between sexuality and procreation, how one of the most influential arguments in favor of legal abortion, how that presupposes this radical separation between sexuality and procreation, and how in some ways, I wonder how this argument could be so influential, because ultimately it is rather, in my judgment at least, counterintuitive, but we will see that argument. So what is the sociological evidence? If it is true that contraceptive behavior is unchaste and thus trivializing human sexuality, then one might think that an increase in contraceptive practice would lead to a rise in the abortion rate. And so let us look at some studies that are raising the question. Is there where I could stand? May I stand? Of course. So, there is. Okay. No, it's also the question of the distance. I just hit 50. Well, last year I'm now 51. But when I hit 50, my eyes started to work differently, and I need to have a certain distance from the paper to read it properly. So I can either look at in your eyes, or I can look at the paper, but I always have to move my glasses. But now I have the right distance from my paper. But if you can still see me, you can see. Yeah. So let us look at some of the statistical evidence. And here we have one study I would like to refer to by a certain Jeffrey Papert, Cicely Marston. They say more contraception leads to less abortion. Okay, that is one example. There are many people who are looking at that and finding such statistics. But then there's one study I found particularly interesting by a certain Bongard and Westhoff, who say in some ways they provide statistical evidence to the contrary, at least in some societies at some historical periods. So they, for instance, looked at Korea as a traditional society, what happened in the years between 1960 and 1978. When we think Korea, I don't know if any of you has been there. It's a very modern country. I'm from Germany, and when I was in Seoul, I thought, wow, we are back 100 years in Germany, like a rural society. It's so modern and so technologically advanced a society. But in 1960 to 1978, it was a very traditional society. And in that period, these sociologists found the phenomenon of an increased contraception rate correlated with an increased abortion rate. And after that, it leveled out. And there was no more change. So they say, why did, between 1960 and 1978 in Korea, why did more contraception lead to more abortion? And they account for this phenomenon by reference to changes in family size preferences and an increasing number of contraceptive failures. The more often people practice contraception, the greater the number of contraceptive failures. They finally conclude that the most effective way to avoid abortions is to prevent unwanted pregnancies and therefore to increase contraceptive prevalence. Again, this what people call common sense, which we will see is not that common sense, but which would be the majority opinion of most of the sociologists. An inverse relation between contraception and abortion seems particularly apparent in Eastern Europe and Russia after the fall of communism. Before the fall of communism, what was the most common practice for birth control? Abortion. Yeah. They didn't even bother about the pill, they didn't bother about the condom, nothing. And they lived as if sexuality was not related to procreation, and if the woman became pregnant, she got the baby done away with. That was normal practice, and they had so many abortions. Then, after the fall of communism, adoption of contraceptive practices increased, and the abortion rate decreased. But even in former communist countries, the association between a decreasing abortion rate and increasing contraceptive prevalence has not been a strict one. This is very interesting. Here there are authors who look what has happened in Slovakia and in the Czech Republic in the 1990s after the fall of communism. In both countries, after the fall of communism, the abortion rate went down. In the Czech Republic, one can also see that the adoption of contraceptive practices went up. In Slovakia, people did not start practicing more contraception. They actually started listening to the Catholic Church more. And according to the sociologist, he says, well, in this country, people were influenced, or the Catholic Church had more influence on people, and this influence actually led to a modification of people's life choices and sexual behavior. Now, this is fantastic. It's just to find at least one country, a small country, where people actually are recorded to have changed their behavior on a social scale. Yeah, and that the abortion rate went down without people starting to practice more contraception. So, to summarize, available sociological data leaves little doubt that increased contraceptive prevalence leads to decreased abortion rates in contexts where abortion was the preferred means of birth control, like in former in communism. Then also, however, we find that the initial impact of contraceptive use on more traditional societies like Korea in the 1960s, that this requires interpretation, and that here increased contraception led to, in some ways, more abortion, or at least the rates are correlated. Yeah? Once one talks of causation, one has to be careful, but we can see the correlation. One finding, or one idea that came to me as I studied these statistics, something became clear to me. I think that can be very, very helpful also in the debate as such, and that is the category of unwanted pregnancy. This category, unwanted pregnancies, usually plays a central role in the arguments, and it's taken as self-evident. Yeah, there are pregnancies that are wanted, pregnancies that are not wanted. These unwanted pregnancies are the reason for abortion. Contraception helps us to limit unwanted pregnancies. But in this study that I cited, people who studied Korea, Marston and Cleland, they said actually, what really important, really interesting, in Korea, they said the promotion and adoption of effective contraceptive practices led to what they call a society's fertility transition. Korea went through a fertility transition in the 1960s. Before that fertility, and they went through this fertility transition because they started using contraceptives. Before that transition, they say, both actual fertility and desired family sizes are high. Which is why here they say couples are at little or no risk of unwanted pregnancies. He says, in the 1960s in Korea, the concept of unwanted pregnancy wasn't around. It didn't exist. There was no risk of people having unwanted pregnancies. People wanted to have children, and they were happy if they had children. And the idea of having unwanted pregnancies wasn't around. That idea actually then came up in the context of the fertility transition. When people started to have different desires, new fertility preferences, as they call it, then suddenly you change your outlook. People change their outlook on sexuality, on family and life in general. And then the category, so maybe the risk, but maybe even the very category of unwanted pregnancy appears. It appears in a post-transitional society. In a pre-transitional society, fertility transition, transition to separating sexuality from procreation, seeing sexuality more for all kinds of purposes, like not procreation, but maybe recreation, also bonding, personal bonding, expression of intimacy, some of the things also very good, but without procreation. The society that has gone through this transition, there you will have the category of unwanted pregnancies. And here they say, you have in these post-transitional societies, these authors, Marsden and Cleland, say, there's a rate of unwanted pregnancies of over 50%. How did we get from 0% to 50% unwanted pregnancies? I think that's a phenomenon. One can ask, how did we get there? How come there are suddenly so many unwanted pregnancies? Not because people have no longer any contraceptive means, but because, and that's the very sociologists here, who admit that. It was on account of the fertility transition, on account of the widespread use of contraceptive means, that people changed their preferences and suddenly had the idea, actually, this is not a child I want. So this is something we see. It's not clear-cut. So in some cases, yes. In some cases, more contraception will mean less abortions. Yes, it can happen. It did happen in Russia, in former communist countries. But also the opposite happened in history. More contraception, more abortions. That happened in traditional countries that went through a so-called fertility transition. So the statistical evidence is not clear-cut and even suggests something very interesting, namely that the very category of unwanted pregnancy is the result of the adoption of, it's the result of contraceptive prevalence. Yeah? So, first part, let's talk about this. The next part, the second part, the question of connatural knowledge. Question of chastity. How does chastity help us to see the preciousness of new human life? Or how, on the contrary, would the trivialization of human sexuality put us at risk to have contempt for new human life? Now, with this contempt for new human life, it's not so much that someone says, oh, I hate babies. Every time I see a baby, I want to kill them. No, not that way. But simply that one says, now, whatever, the pregnant woman says, what's happening in my womb? There's an unwanted lodger. What do I have to do with it? Or even wouldn't call the baby unwanted lodger, but simply say, oh, this, people tell me, is just a lump of cells. Yeah, not necessarily an enemy or anything, but just a lump of cells. If I let this growth in my womb, if I let it grow, I will be responsible for a child. But maybe I can stop this growth just on time.
So it doesn't become.
And it doesn't become a human being, and I don't become a mother. Yeah, and the question is the pregnant woman, how is she referred to in society, and how does she refer to herself? She could refer to herself as mother, or as someone who's about to become a mother. When does motherhood start?
Yeah.
After birth, or at conception? And like here in Italy, usually you say, well, she's becoming a mother. Well, are there degrees? You're a little bit of a mother, you're becoming a mother. Either you are a mother or you're not a mother. No? Yeah, exactly. You're not a little pregnant. That's even in philosophy one of the favorite examples of philosophers to say, well, there some things are this or that way or that way. There are no degrees. But here we are talking of becoming a mother, and she said, well, I'm not a mother yet, so I can do away with the baby. And or the boyfriend or even the husband could say, well, you're not a mother yet. We don't have time. we don't have money, we don't want a child now. Or I don't want a child now. Choose between me and him. Or it. It. Yeah. And then, well, he or it. Maybe he. So, and then, so here is then the root of the, if you want, contempt. And the question is, how come it is so hard to see that here, this being in the womb is not a lump of cells, but a human being, for one. Not only just any human being, but this is, the woman says, it's my son or my daughter. Yeah? And how is it so? How is it even possible people don't see that? And here, this question of connaturality comes in. So there are some philosophers who simply say truth is indifferent or truth is neutral. And Anscombe says there's no neutral truth. Truth has practical value. Because it has practical value, very often it's difficult for us to accept the truth. If your life is on the line, whatever, your doctor says you have cancer, what are you going to do? First thing, probably. Huh? I think, what would you do? Go to a different doctor? No. They get a second opinion. Are you really? That couldn't be true. Yeah, that couldn't be true. So I hear another opinion. Get another account of it. So some truths are very practically relevant, and the more they are practically relevant, the more they touch on our life's project, on what we wanted to do and be and become, the harder it is for us to recognize that, to admit the truth. Sometimes it can be hard for us to accept that 2 and 2 equals 4, if that is has practical relevance for us. So, imagine that. Here, Anscombe says, I quote, truth is not indifferent if it helps or frustrates your purpose to acknowledge it. End of citation. No? Or another citation, no truth is indifferent if it affects what is to be done. Yeah. So, if the truth challenges your lifestyle, challenges everything that you wanted, so let's talk of a woman who became pregnant, who may not know the name of the father, she may not be able to tell in which night the child was conceived. And she never spent a thought on having a child. She has a certain practice, she works hard from Monday to Friday, and Saturday evening she goes and has fun. And as she has fun and is relaxing and practicing recreative things, it turns out that somehow she must have gotten pregnant. And that would mean, what would that mean for her in this case? There's no man who would help her. Maybe her parents would be quite upset. She is becoming a medical doctor in the process. Very difficult educational path. And the child would really disrupt her. Or the child disrupts her actually. Everything she wanted in life is now on the line. And to say, and to look into the mirror and say, yes, I am a mother, would cost her a lot. Maybe more than a lot. It would cost her everything. She looked into the mirror and thought in herself, an about to be medical doctor. And now she thinks, and it might not even be true, that's another thing. Yeah. She thinks if she gives life to this child, then she will never be able to be a medical doctor. She will never be what she wanted to be. And her life concept was not to be wife and mother, but to be medical doctor. And her life concept was not to be medical doctor and wife and mother, but she thought, I can only be a medical doctor, and all I want in my life is to do that. And suddenly to say, this is your son or daughter in your womb, would mean that all her life plans, in her subjective imagination, one could also help her and see maybe not everything crumbles. But now in her subjective imagination, everything crumbles. Her life has just come to an end. And then there's a colleague of hers, another medical doctor, who says, well, listen, didn't you pay attention in class? This is not a human person. This is not even a human being. This is just a cell growth. We're harvesting that, we're working with that in a test tube. It's nothing different. You've handled those tissues in a petri dish, no? You just put it away. Take this pill or go to a soon-to-be colleague of yours, gynecologist, and away with it. It's just a lump of tissues. And then suddenly this theory that the embryo, the human even initial fetus, where you actually already see the human form, but you manage in some ways to convince yourself
It's not.
it's not. It's just a lump of cells. Because so much is at stake. So much is at stake. So the recognition of the dignity of human life is practical knowledge, especially if we recognize it, something is at stake for us. We are stakeholders in that truth. And then it can become really difficult for us to acknowledge it. And this, even with the father, things may be at stake for him. And he just says, well, it's just a lump of cells. So how can someone not see the preciousness of human life? It is just because of that. And you see, the issue is we are so used, our people, in our society, people are so used to living their sexuality as if it had nothing to do with the procreation of their sons and daughters, that when then they conceive their child, their son or daughter, they don't feel like they can take responsibility. And they feel like it's impossible. So here Anscombe, already in 1981, in an essay, Anscombe is a British philosopher, student of Wittgenstein's, passed away beginning of this millennium. She said, abortion has indeed now come to be regarded as a long stop for unwanted conceptions and a desirable means of population control. One could say, if you want to promote abortion, promote contraception. The idea of having a backstop, a long stop, she says, well, a backup if you want. Long stop is from cricket, it's a very specific English-British kind of game. But say a backup for failed contraception. And if you look at, it's very interesting, usually Supreme Court judges are not philosophers, but it's very interesting to see that the Supreme Court decision in the United States in 1992, Supreme Court judged the case Planned Parenthood of Pennsylvania versus Casey. The court ruling was that they couldn't change Roe v. Wade of 1973 because in the meantime people had become accustomed to a particular lifestyle, quote, in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail. End of quotation. So we can't do that to people. Now, the more recent ruling of the Supreme Court, as happy as we can be about it, one also has to see that they didn't say, well, the human being in the womb is a human being and a person and deserves unconditional recognition of its right to life. The Supreme Court recently just said, overturning Roe v. Wade, said the Supreme Court shouldn't make laws because there's separation of powers. The court is judging on whether a law has been implemented. A court shouldn't make laws. And therefore, Roe v. Wade actually was not a court decision. It invented a law. It made a law. It didn't interpret a law. There was no law to interpret. Privacy is not a question of right to life or abortion or anything. So they said this was our colleagues of 1973 were too creative. They did what they shouldn't have done. They made a law. The judges don't make laws. And they said, well, the decision is up to where it belongs, to Parliament. So they said each parliament, each state parliament, needs to make its legislation because the Parliament makes laws, not the courts. Or there should be a federal law on it. Yeah. So, but the ruling of 1992 was really helpful to see the argumentation, because people have become accustomed to abortion as Anscoms. They've become to a lifestyle. Contraception promotes a lifestyle. And it promotes a lifestyle that makes it necessary to be able to have recourse to abortion. Now, what I wanted, this could already be one of essentially the main argument. There is, you see, in 1971, I don't know if I can make this in 2 minutes, but Father Giordano, the Thompson argument, do I have time for it? Should we just stop? Yeah? In 1971, a certain Judith Thompson published an essay called In Defense of Abortion, and up to date, it is one of the most influential papers written in defense of abortion. It's if you enter any theoretical discussion with people who advocate abortion, or even if you argue against it, in some ways, this is an article you have to refer to, kind of academically. It's so important, so influential. And what I find so interesting is that this article has become so important and so influential. So the author claims, in defense of abortion, that it doesn't matter, for her argument, whether we recognize the child in the mother's womb as a person. It is independent of that. The legal status, she says, of abortion is independent from the legal status, legal or moral status of the child in the womb. And it's not a question of whether this child has dignity or whatever, what status we assign to the child, or that we understand the child to have. Her argument, essentially, the essay is around one analogy. And everything turns around. The question is this analogy suitable or not? So she says, essentially, she says, a woman who's finding herself pregnant finds herself in a similar situation as the following that I now explain. Imagine someone breaks into your house and kidnaps you, renders you unconscious, and puts some foam in your nose, and you're unconscious, and you wake up, and you wake up in a hospital bed. Next to you, there's a famous violinist, most famous violinist, who is usually attracting millions, thousands of people, like the Bob Marley of violinists, the Bruce Springsteen of all violinists. He is next to you, and you find yourself, you see, well, there are many tubes and stuff. So you see, actually, this famous violinist has been hooked up to your bloodstream. Why? Because his kidneys are about to fail. They don't have any, for some reason, they don't have the dialysis machines, and no one finds your blood, his blood type except you. You're the only one who's got his blood type. And so they hooked this guy up to your bloodstream. And you're cleaning his blood for him. You're kind of an organic dialysis machine for him. And they tell you, well, you need to be here for 9 months until we find an organ, a donor organ to implant, and then he'll be okay. But 9 months you have to be in this bed and sustain the life of this famous violinist. And she says, well, in this case, what do we make of this? Evidently, the importance of the famous violinist is that here we have someone with dignity. No, he's not only has he human dignity, he has musical dignity. He's important in the world of music. So it's important that he live, no? He's got dignity. And does he have a right to life? Yeah, no one denies he's got a right to life. Is he a human person? No one denies he's a human person. But then Thompson asked himself, no one asked me. Just find myself here. He's asking 9 months of my life, 9 months of lying in bed. Am I morally obliged to give him that time? To give him myself for 9 months? And she says, well, if I decide to do that, I'm a not only a good Samaritan, I'm a best Samaritan. I'm just an incredibly good Samaritan. And no one, and then she says, no one can be asked to be this super Samaritan. Yeah, it's enough to be an average good Samaritan, but not a super duper Samaritan. No. No one can ask that of me. By justice. If in justice I say, dear violinist, I'm very sorry, but actually I have something to do. I need to do my shopping. I need to go to work. I need to write a book. I don't know. I have things to do. So I'm sorry. Maybe you could have knocked and asked, but you just popped up here without my consent. And what I don't give consent to, that happens to me, I'm not obliged to continue. Arrivederci. Yeah? And so she says, well, the child in the womb is like this violinist. He has got dignity, all right, but he just pops up without having asked me. I have to give him 9 months. I have to hook him up to my bloodstream. And if I want to, that's great. But if I don't, I walk. And that's for her the question of pregnancy. Now, one can say many things to this. For one, more immediate things, and then to go more to the base. For one, Thompson presupposes that our only obligations we have toward other people are those obligations that we voluntarily, deliberately assume. But that doesn't have to be granted. I mean, actually, there are legislations. In Germany, we have a legislation. You witness an accident, someone gets hurt, you are closest to that person. And if you just walk on because you say, I have better things to do, you actually are responsible, made responsible by criminal law. A criminal. You become a criminal. So the law is penalizing. You say, no, you have the responsibility to someone who is in an accident, to someone in need. If you can help, even before the law, you are responsible. Now, even if you never decided to. But, so this is one thing. But then the issue is, evidently in her analogy, the person finding herself or himself or whatever in the hospital bed, with the famous violinist, finds herself there through an act of violence. And one could say, okay, now in case of rape, not to say in case of rape, abortion is illicit, no, not to say that. Simply to say, in case of rape, I could vaguely imagine how you came up with this analogy, even though I don't agree. Ultimately, I don't agree, but I can vaguely imagine how you could think that. But she actually explicitly says, no, this is not just in case of rape. Any kind of pregnancy is that way. Okay, so then it's becoming interesting because, see, the way maybe some of you are parents, are mothers here, even if you're not. I mean, how does the child usually appear in the womb?
By the force of nature.
By force of nature, like that, yeah. Usually, so like the interesting thing in this analogy is all the elements that go into a child coming into a womb for which there are no analogs in this analogy. What is missing? Who is missing? What is missing? Well, for instance, where's the father? Usually children have fathers. There's no father in the analogy. There's not even an analogy for the sexual act. So she's able to think of a pregnancy without ever thinking of sexual activity. Sexuality and procreation are radically separated. And even conceptually, her idea of pregnancy, she manages to think of pregnancy without thinking of the father or of the sexual act. I find that very curious. So there's one commentator, a certain John Wilcox. He says, I wonder if Thompson knows where babies come from. Yeah, he actually he committed this comment into writing and published it in the journal.
Even in the arguments from an IVF point of view, you still have a donor.
Yeah.
So there's still a factor. Yeah. That's a factor.
So
Right.
So to mention this article, simply to say how profound in our mentality, in our cultures, in our times, how profound is the separation between sexuality and procreation. That the most important, the most influential article in defense of abortion can make do without correlating in any meaningful way a pregnancy with a sexual act. Yeah? The separation is profound. And I think that here, so to come back now in conclusion to come back to John Paul II, if we ask, if we ask what kind of being is that, what is the kind of being that has appeared in the woman's womb? Now, if we can in some ways relate it to our activity, we can also feel responsible for it. And if we think sexuality and procreation together, or if we can teach our children in the next generation, or ourselves act responsibly in this way, that is to say, this is a kind of act, this is a kind of practice through which we can become father and mother. And can we actually do that? Can we responsibly become father and mother? If two can say yes, well, then they can have legitimate intercourse, but usually one would say, or reasonably one would say, the two can say yes, under which condition? That they have promised their lives. Because the child they may conceive will join them forever. Yeah, two people are joined forever in the child. The child has an immortal soul, even if the woman aborts the child. The two will be joined forever in that child who has got an immortal soul before God. And even if people, divorce, they used to call themselves by their first names, and then they divorce, but they have children. How do they call each other? Yeah, they don't like to talk about my ex-wife, my ex-husband. It hurts. And they say ex is over, so no longer talk about husband or wife. But what is not over?
Child.
That means the other is
Related from
the
my
father or
son.
the mother. Yeah. I have to bring him to his father. I have to bring him to his mother. That remains. That remains. And given that this remains, one is father and mother of the same child forever, it makes perfect sense. For the sake of one's own mental sanity and one's own affective sanity, one's own sanity, period. It makes sense for the sake of the child's health and sanity, and for the sake of society, that only two people who are joined in a promise, in a definitive promise, in a definitive commitment in marriage, that only those engage in those acts that can bind them together forever. Yeah, that they already say it with a promise to each other. And they ask themselves, are we ready? Can we say yes forever, or yes for this life at least? If we can say that, well, let's say that, and then we can have children. Or if we can't say that, well, that also means that if we get pregnant now, it would be a disaster, no? So let's not do something that would for us be a disaster. Let's be responsible. Yeah? And so by promoting chastity, chastity is the virtue that makes us think, among other things, it makes us think of sexuality as related to procreation. It helps us to think together those powers by which we can be the origin, to think together sexuality and procreation. Chastity guards and it treasures the powers and the very acts by which we can be at the origin of another person's life. This is something great. I can be at the origin of another person's life. You look around. Each one of you is a miracle. Each one of you, each one of us is special. Like we look at each other's eyes, we look in the face, we look, we say, wow, this is amazing, a miracle, loved, a person loved by God. And these are the children that are conceived in the sexual act. So I can be the origin, and we can be the origin of another person's life. And if we look at it this way, if we consider ourselves that way, then that will advance the respect of humanity. And this is what